I'm really delighted to be here and share some stories with you about witchcraft. The topic of my talk, the title is a bit strange, anti-witchcraft. And some of you who know the work of Clifford Geertz might hear a sardonic reference to his essay, Anti-Relativism, in which he staked out a claim against the anti-relativists, but arguing that being against them didn't mean you were a relativist. And I want to stake out a similar kind of claim in a way. There are a lot of people around who are anti-witchcraft, even some who are what I call anti-witchcraft. And I think they're barking up the wrong tree. But that doesn't mean that I'm pro-witchcraft. That's just a note. The other thing about what I mean by anti-witchcraft is the sort of stuff that people in Africa spend a lot of time, money, and effort on doing. Witchcraft is a huge problem in many communities in Africa. And the struggle against witchcraft, the efforts to find witches and to neutralize witches and to protect oneself and one's family against witchcraft is a major effort. And that's what I call anti-witchcraft. Sometimes this devolves into violence. Now, outsiders typically call that witchcraft violence, when people go and beat up a witch or burn a witch or something like that. But that's really anti-witchcraft violence. It's not witchcraft violence. Witchcraft violence is the violence that witches do. So again, the anti-witchcraft element of this talk is about the people who are opposed to the efforts of Africans to solve their problems relating to witchcraft. Let me back up a bit and just tell you where I'm coming from with this. As some of you know, I've done a little bit of work on witchcraft in Africa. And over the years, various people have pointed me to some of the ways in which my work has been taken up by people in other fields. And one of these fields is international human rights issues. And over the last decade or so, there's been a growing interest in international organizations, humanitarian activists, and various other people and organizations in issues of witchcraft in Africa. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women has written a report addressing issues of witchcraft in Africa. The Special Rapporteur of the UN on extrajudicial killings has discussed it. The United Nations High Commission on Refugees has done work on it. UNICEF has written reports on it. Various non-government organizations like Save the Children have addressed issues of witchcraft in Africa. And as I say, sometimes they reference my work, and it tends to be a bit dismaying when you see work that you've worked very hard and carefully to get a subtle grip on these issues, then being kind of flattened out into NGO speak kind of thing. And in 2009, the other aspect of this was that I was in a small town in Malawi called Balaka, doing research on AIDS. I'd got a bit tired of witchcraft. And so there I'm in this small town, and I hear everybody's buzzing about the witch trial that's about to take place. And I go, that's interesting. I didn't know that there were witch trials still happening in 2009. So on the appointed day, I made my way to the magistrate's court in Balaka to observe this witch's trial. And it was a very, very interesting experience. And I subsequently got the judgment of this case and found other judgments by the magistrate in witchcraft trials, both criminal and civil, and spent a lot of time reading them and thinking about what was going on. And what I'll be trying to tell you about today is a description of how a witch trial takes place in 21st century Africa in a properly constituted court of law. And I find it very interesting, and I hope you will too. So the point that these two interests come together is this. The interest in violence against suspected witches, I think, is somewhat misplaced, because violence against witches happens very, very infrequently in Africa. When it does, it is sometimes very brutal and very horrifying. It occurred to me at one point to show you a YouTube video of witches being burnt in Kenya, but it's so disturbing that I can't even look at it. However, if you're interested, you can easily Google witch burning Kenya, and you'll find YouTube videos of people being burnt as witches. It's horrifying, and the spectacular nature of this violence often stimulates, a great sense of outrage amongst outsiders. But that is extremely rare. And sometimes there are witch-finding movements that get out of control, and there might be many victims. But for the most part, when people are suspected of being witches, nothing is done to them. So the violence that is perpetrated by witches, the feeling that people are victimized by witchcraft, that they're being made ill, being killed, being all sorts of misfortunes being vested on them, is much, much more widespread than witchcraft accusations, let alone violence against witches. So that's why I say the interest is misplaced. Because the real problem of witchcraft violence is the violence being done by witches to people. The sense that everyday people have of being subjected to illegitimate violence by other persons. That's witchcraft. That's the big issue in Africa. The issue is not witchcraft accusations or violence against witches. Now, the big question, it seems to me, is this. If you look at the question of justice and witchcraft, from the outside human rights perspective, there can never be, if a witch is targeted, is denounced, is accused, it's an infringement of their rights, by definition, because there is no such thing as witchcraft. So if you accuse somebody of being a witch, if you do anything about it, you're infringing upon their rights. You're perpetrating an injustice on an innocent person. Innocent by definition. Yet on the other hand, from the African perspective, and I say African in a very loose but I think justifiable sense, the question of justice is the damage and violence done by witches to the people. Now the big question, it seems to me, is there a way of satisfying the demands of justice that might respect the rights, the dignity of the accused, as well as addressing the sense of injustice and the sense of insecurity that is created by living in a world with witches? And as I say, the short answer from the human rights humanitarian perspective is no. But in practice, I think there is an emerging jurisprudence that I witnessed in this court in Africa and I've read about in other places that tries to do that tries to provide witches with a fair trial, that respects their rights, that tries to come to judgment in a way that secures justice. And as I say, I found this in these judgments by this unknown magistrate in a small town in Malawi. The other thing I want to say about the humanitarian and the international interest in witchcraft and violence against witches is that it bears an uncanny resemblance to the attitude of colonial officials and colonial law to the problem of witches and witchcraft. Specifically, that since witches can't exist, any activity that's done in order to control their danger must be at best misguided, and at worst criminal. And the legacy of colonial law in relation to these issues is one in which I think the fact that the colonial authorities could not recognize the significance of witchcraft violence, of witchcraft in communities, and at the same time criminalized efforts by Africans to control and manage witchcraft in their communities, led to, I think, a fundamental undercutting of respect for law, for formal law in the colonial and post-colonial courts. And I think the general sense was that the law protects witches at the expense of the victims of witches. And I think the international interest replicates this to a great degree. Later on, I'll outline some aspects of the colonial legal situation in relation to witchcraft, which remains in force in many African states today. And again, let me just, as an example, to put this issue of the violence done against witches compared to the violence done by witches into perspective. There's a wonderful organization in Malawi. Does everyone know where Malawi is? Malawi is a tiny little country in southern Central Africa, right on the lake, on the southernmost of the Great Lakes of Africa. Very poor, very small, about the size of Pennsylvania. It's pretty insignificant. But it's a very interesting place to study these kinds of issues because it's been fairly stable, peaceful, politically stable, more or less a democracy now, very poor. It has a functioning court system, and it also has serious problems with witchcraft. But there's an organization in Malawi which is really wonderful. It's it reminds me of Don Quixote. It's called the Association of Secular Humanists, run by a man called George Tindwa. There was another guy, a white guy, an old Malawian white guy who died last year, but it's basically George Tindwa. And George Tindwa is a very rare species of person, an African atheist. And he's constantly railing against the stupidity of religion and also the stupidity of believing in witches and the injustice that's being done to witches. And he's a fabulous guy. He's the sort of guy who, on a bus, if you've ever been on a bus in Africa, you get half a mile down the street and someone's up there praying and preaching and thumping the Bible. And most people enjoy this and at the very least think that it's a good thing to do. Whereas George will say, shut up, but you're infringing on my rights. I don't want to hear this nonsense. And if you've ever been in an African bus and seen someone, well, you'll never have seen someone do that, but they chuck him off the bus, out in the middle of nowhere. There he is with his rights. So he's a classic. He really is. And so he and a sociologist from Chancellor College got funding from the Norwegian embassy in Lilongwe to do a study of witchcraft violence, or what I would call anti-witchcraft violence. And it's it's one of these NGO report things. You can download it on the web if you're interested. But deep inside, there was a little discussion. I mean, the whole thing is about the terrible business of witchcraft violence. The horrible abuses that are going on. But there's a mention of 84 interviews, unstructured interviews that they did. Not a random sample, not a scientific sample in any way, but they did 84, key informant, in-depth interviews. And out of these 84 informants, 10 had experience of being bewitched, of being victims of witchcraft. So 10 out of 84, that's 84 heads of households. So that's 84 families. That's a lot of people. Now, out of those 10, and this is the hard data. David was asking me before whether I was going to have some data. Here's your data. Out of those 10 people who felt that they'd been bewitched, 7 said they knew who the witch was. So 7 out of 10 knew who it was. But only one of the 7 confronted the witch. And it doesn't mention in what way that confrontation took place. So you got the numbers in your head there? That means that only one witch is confronted for every 10 people in this instance that felt themselves to be a victim of witches, most of whom knew who the witch was. So, deep inside this report that was supposed to show that, it shows that, in fact, more than 10 to 1, the relation of insult to injury is 1 to 10. That 10 times more people feel themselves victims of witches than witches are confronted. So you see what I'm getting at? The problem is big on that domain. So back to the question of justice. What would justice look like in relation to witchcraft? For people who feel that they have been victims of witchcraft, for people who feel that they or members of their family or community have been attacked by witchcraft violence, by, okay, it's a mystical, supernatural, occult, call it what you will, form of violence, but violence nonetheless, with perceived real consequences. What would witchcraft look like? And incidentally, I'll say, for those of you who are going to be reading my little book, Madumo, later on, or have read my other book, I have addressed some of these issues in relation to security. How do people try to secure themselves from the dangers of supernatural forces of one kind or another? And in this work, I'm looking at, after the damage has been done, what does justice look like? And I think the answer to that is quite simple. What do you need for justice? You need a fair trial. Well, I mean, if violence has been done, if damage has been done, a fair trial. So what would a fair trial look like? It would look the same as any other kind of fair trial. It would have to be in a properly constituted forum with a properly constituted authority running it according to established procedures, settled precedent. You want a trial in a court. Now, whether that's the chief's court or the magistrate's court or, the family setting or something, but you'd want that. You'd also want, secondly, I think, clear proof of guilt. Fair trial need proof. And finally, you'd want punishment that fitted the crime. And one of the major concerns in Africa about witchcraft and anti-witchcraft violence is that although people generally say, when a witch is burnt, yes, she was a witch, but we don't approve of the way she was burnt. It was mob justice. Typically, when violence is perpetrated against suspected witches, it happens in that kind of vigilante mob, spur of the moment, kind of context. People, on the other hand, say a fair trial would be the way to go. So what I want to do is try and tell you the story now of at least one fair trial, or that I considered to be a fair trial, and just to see if we can look at the anatomy of this trial. Incidentally, before I do this, let me just refer to another irony of history, that nearly 300 years after the 1736 Witchcraft Act was passed in England, outlawing witch trials, there are still witch trials going on in this country and in other advanced countries in properly constituted courts of law. Is anyone surprised to hear that? You are, Ralph? Well, what is a witch trial? A witch trial is fundamentally identifying whether or not a certain person is or is not a witch. Does that satisfy? That is happening as we speak. Can you guess what court system this is happening in? Nope. refugee courts. Under the 1952 Convention on Refugees, there is a section there where people can seek asylum based on membership of a particular social group, being persecuted by virtue of membership of a group. And what's happening is that witches are being interpreted as a particular social group. And so if you can demonstrate that you are a witch, or at least in your country of origin, you are considered a witch, and if you're forced to return, you will be treated as a witch and killed, then that is ground for asylum. And there was a case, it's very hard to find the judgments in these cases because these courts are very squirrely things, you know. But I found reference to one in which a Guinean woman in New York with an intersex child was granted asylum on the ground that if she was forced to return to Guinea, she would be considered a witch and subject to persecution. I also found a case, it's easier to find cases that don't work. There was a case in Australia, in Melbourne, in last June, in which a Nigerian guy claimed to be having been persecuted as a suspected witch and beaten up and threatened. You know. The tribunal didn't buy his story, but they said this is a possible ground for asylum, membership of a particular social group. There's also a wonderful judgment from the High Court of Australia where a judge is making the hypothetical argument about what is not a particular social group. And the case in issue then was whether being a young male in Afghanistan was a particular social group. Because the applicant was saying, I'm a young man, if I was returned, I'd be forced to join the Taliban, and that would be persecution. So the judge is saying, imagine a society that believed in witches. Now, witches don't exist, but if there was a general belief that they did, that would constitute a social group, and blah, blah, blah. So, I kid you not, these witch trials are going on. Now, okay, if you are judged to be a witch, you don't get burned at the stake anymore. You get a visa and asylum, and so it's a whole other thing. But it's still a witch trial. And I find it, it's such a wonderful irony that I think the old colonial administrators are spinning in their graves with their gin and tonics, chuckling away. And it's also being considered an emerging field of refugee law. There's courses in Oxford a couple of months ago where anthropologists teach lawyers how to advocate these claims. It's a terrific thing because if you think about the number of people who could make successful claims to persecution on the grounds of being suspected as witches, it could really open up the asylum highway. So that's an aside. Back to the Balaka first grade magistrates court. And the case of the Casitos. I call it the case of the Casitos. It doesn't have any headline. And I got the judgment and the documents in this from the magistrate's office. They weren't published, but they exist. Let me tell the background of this. There's a family called the Casitos. They live in a relatively well-to-do part of a pretty poor town. One of the uncles in the family, Fabiano, dies. And his sister, Annie, is accused of killing him using witchcraft. And his sons beat her up. She doesn't go report it to the police because she knows if she reports them to the police, they might get arrested. Malawi jails are not much fun. So she just puts up with it. And they didn't burn her house down this time, but it was a bit of a family issue. Another brother, Masalzo, goes to the traditional healer, and the traditional healer does the divination process and determines that Fabiano had indeed been killed by witches using a magic hammer, and they beat him on the head, and that the witches were teaching children witchcraft, and that the children in the family were being taught witchcraft and inducted into the world of witches, and that he, Masalzo, was the next in line for the treatment with the magic hammer. So various things take place, arguments take place. Apparently, the suspected teachers of witchcraft are taken to the village headman's court, then to the group village headman's court, but various things go on, but there's no resolution to this. Now let me just tell you something about teaching children witchcraft. In Malawi, this is one of the biggest fears. There are stories up and down the lot about teaching children witchcraft. And if you think about it, it's a terrible, terrible thing. How do we think about it? Like, is it like, say, you know, your kid goes to school and comes back with some appalling idea, like, you know, imagine you're a deeply conservative, evangelical, Bible-based Christian family, and kid comes home spouting evolution. You know, your kid has been just, you know, perverted in some sense. Or maybe, you know, you're a nice lesbian couple and your kid come home telling you that homosexuality is a disease that can be cured. You know, like, this is upsetting. Let's put it that way. Teaching children witchcraft is similarly upsetting, but it's worse. Maybe it's like child abuse. Maybe it's like the physical and sexual abuse of a child. Imagine how you'd feel if your child came home and had been raped. That would be, you know, a terrible, terrible feeling. And the thought that someone is teaching your child witchcraft is all that and worse. In fact, this idea of sexual abuse can be part of that. You might fear that the child is being sexually abused in the process of this. But it's worse. It's much worse. Because when your child becomes a witch, in this context, they then participate in feasts on human flesh, and eventually they're going to be required to kill a member of their family in order to contribute to the feasting of witches. So your child is being turned into a killer who's going to kill, you know, probably his or her mother or grandmother or someone nearby, and a cannibal. So, you know, if you take this stuff seriously, as people do, it's extremely worrying to think of someone teaching children witchcraft. And I should also say, too, when we talk about witches and witchcraft, it's very important to get a few very elementary distinctions straight. Most people in the West, I take it people in this room, when they talk about witchcraft or witches, they'd be thinking about belief in witches. These people believe in witches. I don't believe in witches. So witches exist for them, but not for me. But they don't really exist, but there is a belief. The belief exists. But that's a fundamentally mistaken way of approaching the problem. And if you read my second book on witchcraft, there's a discussion of why that is so. I won't go into it all here. For people in Africa, people who live anywhere in a world with witches, witchcraft and witches is not a matter of belief. It's about action. Witches do things, to wit, witchcraft. So it's a form of action which has consequences. And people believe certain things about that form of action, but the belief itself isn't what's important, it's the action. It's also the term witch can refer to, if you like, a form of being. There's an old anthropological distinction that's very famous between witchcraft and sorcery. And then witchcraft is a kind of a condition of persons and its inherent capacities, and sorcery is done with herbs and substances and so on. And the history of the anthropology of witchcraft in Africa is always trying to figure out whether this distinction applies in this particular place or not, and generally they find, well, it doesn't actually apply here. People mix this all up, but we're still holding to the distinction. I prefer to think of a distinction between being and action. So anybody can do witchcraft, which is the action, an illegitimate form of violence perpetrated on others by, let's call it, supernatural means. Now, that supernatural means might be special knowledge that I possess, or special knowledge that some expert possesses that I buy, or it might be created as part of a relationship that I set up with evil spirits or demons or the devil or whatever. But it's something that somebody, otherwise normal, ordinary human being does. Witchcraft is a form of being is something else altogether. That's where the witch is this different kind of being, at once seemingly human, but actually not human. Subhuman, but also at the same time superhuman, because they possess extraordinary powers and capacities in their being. And it's useful to hold on to that distinction. As I say, it's not, it's a kind of conceptual distinction that applies in ways people talk about witchcraft. It's not a kind of absolute distinction like the idea of witchcraft and sorcery. And so the children being taught witchcraft are being inducted into this other form of being. And it's important also to remember that although we're talking often about witches in Africa as children or the elderly or women, the people that the international human rights people like to call vulnerable groups, in the world of witches, these are not vulnerable people. They're super powerful people. They're very dangerous people. That little old lady over there is not just a little old lady, sweet little old lady who's vulnerable. You know, she is a dangerous, dangerous thing. And it's also important to remember that it's not always such a bad thing to be considered dangerous. There's a lot of talk about child witches and so on, and the image of children just being abused by being considered to have these witchcraft powers. But if people think that you have superpowers, you can actually achieve various things. It's not always necessarily a bad thing. But getting back to Malawi, people do worry enormously about their children being taught witchcraft. So the story was then that the old man of the family, Mr. Bartlett Casito, his daughter Annie, and her son Shaibu were teaching witchcraft to the children in the family. So when nothing could be done, Masautsu went to the police and laid a charge with the police, a charge of witchcraft against his father, his sister, and his nephew. Now, witchcraft isn't illegal under the laws of Malawi. There is a Witchcraft Act in effect in Malawi, which is modelled on the 1736 law of England, which was introduced in 1911 and remains in force, and which does a number of things. It outlaws accusation of witchcraft, it outlaws divination to find witches, it outlaws trials of witches in chief's courts, it outlaws ordeals, poison ordeals where someone's given poison and if they die they're a witch, if they survive they're not a witch. And it outlaws raising funds to find witches and deal with the problem. So it's really, it's a kind of, again, it's an anti-witchcraft law. It prevents people from doing anything about witchcraft. And it's deeply resented in Malawi. And in other parts of Africa where laws like this were in place, sometimes they've been amended to allow genuine witchcraft cases to go forward. It's a complicated issue. I don't want to go into too much detail. But it is illegal, it's not illegal to practice witchcraft in Malawi. It is, however, illegal under Section 6 of the Witchcraft Act to pretend to practice witchcraft. That was the other thing that the 1736 law did. To pretend to have the powers of a witch is illegal. Now, people often say, well, these laws were introduced to try and eradicate the belief in witches in Africa. Nonsense. They didn't give a damn about people believing or not believing in witches for the most part. These laws were introduced in Africa pretty much for the same reason they were introduced in England. In England in 1736, people were still worried deeply about witches. For a century or more, leading intellectuals could say, witches are a real and a serious problem. But for a generation, at least before the 1736 law, the cases weren't coming to courts, and courts were reluctant to deal with the issues because it's damn hard to prove witchcraft. But what this act did was it allowed the authorities to go after various kinds of fakers, to fortune tellers, to vagrants, to people who claimed to have supernatural power to deal with this problem that was deeply felt. And in the African context, it empowered the colonial authorities with the ability to deal with chiefs who might start holding witchcraft trials and killing witches, because, as we all know, it's only in the name of the law that people can be killed, and if I'm the law, I don't want you having that right. And the other thing too, it empowered them to go after what they called witch doctors, or we'd call them traditional healers now, who could sometimes amass considerable political capital by dealing with witchcraft. So again, these laws remain in place, and that key provision, pretending to the power of witchcraft, is the section under which the police charged Mr. Casito, Annie, and Shaibu. So those three were arrested and brought to prison, put in prison for several months before the trial, charged with pretending to the powers of witchcraft. The accusers were three children, a 5-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 10-year-old. So the case comes to trial, and Magistrate Damson Banda, who's magistrate first grade in Malawi, in the Balaka Magistrate Court, heard the trial. Now, if I'd been the magistrate, I would have looked at this and go, witchcraft isn't illegal. These people have not committed any crime. We can't have a trial. There's an irony, though. If you're charged with witchcraft in Malawi, there's no crime. But if you plead guilty, you've then committed a crime. And then you can be got under the Witchcraft Act because you're pretending to the powers of witchcraft by pleading guilty to being a witch. So it is a bit ironic. You've got to be on your toes once the police come looking for you for witchcraft. So knowing this, Magistrate Banda still holds the trial. And he calls the three children as the witnesses. And the first thing he does is administer the oath on the Bible. But first of all, he does a voir dire to ask the children whether they understand what they're doing in making an oath. And he decides that only the older one is capable of giving sworn testimony. Now, this is important because there have been cases appealed to the High Court in Malawi where children have given testimony that was uncorroborated and they weren't in a position to really testify under oath. So the magistrate is very careful not to just take their stories. The one does testify under oath. The others testify without swearing the oath. Now, you've got to remember, what is the oath? What is happening in an oath? Well, an oath is a commitment. It can be various kinds of commitment, but in the legal content in the court is the commitment to tell the truth, to speak the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. So help me God. Supernatural sanction. I mean, this is not just an abstract little idea. There is a force out there that will mess with you if you don't tell the truth. It's invoking a relationship with another invisible power. So anyway, the children's story is that they're being taught witchcraft by these three, that they go flying in the night. They sometimes go to Cape Town, sometimes to Liverlidzi River, sometimes a long way at night. They eat human flesh. They go to the graveyard. They play football with the head of someone else's baby. Then the witches told the children that they should kill Masaltso with the magic hammer, but they refused, and blah, 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 blah. So this is the whole testimony. The magistrate writes it all down, longhand, every single word. And so we hear the children. After hearing the children, the magistrate decides there is a case to answer. Again, I would have gone, are you kidding me? Flying through the night, eating, enough. These are just crazy kids. They're all upset. But no, there's a case to answer. And the legal basis of the case to answer is that if it is true that children are being taught witchcraft, then the people doing the teaching, by definition, are pretending to the powers of witchcraft, and therefore in violation of Section 6 of the Witchcraft Act, and therefore punishable by up to 5 years in prison. So let's hear whether or not this is actually the case. So he gets the evidence from the defendants. The three defendants tell their story. The old man gets up and tells a pathetic story that goes on. It's clear that he's been accused of witchcraft for years. Everybody knows he's a witch. He seems to be in his 80s at least. He's been had up in front of the village headman, in front of the group village headman. He's been forced to undergo what he calls an ordeal. Now, the poison ordeal, outlawed in 1911, was actively suppressed during the colonial era. It is not supposed to still exist. If you read the anthropological literature, there's some very kind of excited, breathless stuff from the 1950s of people hearing about ordeals that their informants heard about when they were kids, kind of thing. It was like thought to have disappeared altogether. But here's this old man saying he was forced to undergo an ordeal, and he had to drink some herbs, and he survived. Therefore, he's not a witch. That is his defense. I survived the ordeal, therefore I'm not a witch. Then the woman gets up, tells all the story of all the trips to the herbalist and this and that, and this incredibly complicated family drama that would, fill a TV series for months. And that's her story. She also calls another brother who testifies on behalf of the defendants and whose testimony seems to be to the effect that, yeah, the old man is a witch, but these ones aren't. Because this and that and the other thing. And we went to the herbalist, and the herbalist said, no, she's not a witch. She's a victim of witchcraft. Her child's head is being used as a football, and that's why it's sick. So anyway, the three people, defendants, testify, and then the case rests, and the verdict is given. Now, what I find really interesting is then when it comes to the verdict. As I said, to me, open and shut case, nobody's guilty of witchcraft, blah, 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 go home. But the magistrate goes through a very interesting process of legal reasoning, where first of all, he explains that witchcraft is not against the law, although it should be. He's very clear that it's a real problem and that the law should be changed and so on, but we are constrained by the law that's on the books, and witchcraft is not against the law. So the only way, and then he reads judgments to show the only way that you can be convicted of witchcraft is through confession. If the witch does not confess, then under Section 6, no conviction. But in the process of this, he then reviews the evidence. And he reviews the evidence pertaining to Annie and says basically she went to a healer and was told that she was the one suffering from witchcraft, and kind of lets her off the hook. And then the grandson, Shaibu, he reviews that evidence and lets him off the hook. And then reviews the evidence against the old man and pretty much concludes that, yeah, he is a witch. We can't convict him. And then he speaks from the bench to the family and says, it's my opinion, in my view, you should remove the old man from Balaka and take him back to Zomba, where he originally comes from. And that, to me, is the judgment. There have been two trials going on. One strictly according to the law, one an informal trial, just as much a witch trial, in which, so in the legal one, 3 innocent, not guilty verdicts. This one guilty verdict and the punishment of banishment, which is a standard form of punishment for witches. You remove the witch from the place where they're causing problems. And I do not believe for a minute, although I haven't spoken to the people, but I don't think that they were distinguishing between, this sentence, the magistrate speaking in the name of the law, and this one is his personal opinion. This is the magistrate speaking from on high and passing judgment on the witches. Now, if I had time, I'd tell you another case, a civil case, in which a senior nurse at the hospital was accused of teaching children witchcraft by 2 junior nurses. And this thing got out of control. They had a kind of impromptu witch trial in the manager's office at the hospital. They had a public meeting at the hospital. All the hospital staff signed a letter to the Ministry of the Health demanding that this woman be removed. This goes on for months. She becomes a total pariah in town. So then she sues these 2 young women for defamation. And that's the witch trial that I saw the first time around. It wasn't a witch trial, it was a defamation suit, a civil suit for defamation against 2 junior nurses. And in the course of the trial, I saw these 2 young women basically call this lady a witch to her face. It was open and shut. And I was wondering how this magistrate would resolve this, because everybody in town was convinced that this woman was a witch and that this was a witch trial. And so if he had said, yep, that's slander, you 2 were saying she's a witch, and That's damaged her reputation, so pay the damages. Then everybody in town would have said, this guy is on the side of the witches, and this is not a legitimate court at all. So I was very curious to see how he resolved this issue, and did so with, I think, the wisdom of Solomon. On the first ground, he said, no, the suit fails because it wasn't these two women. They had custody of children. They weren't the ones who called her a witch. It was the children. So she should have sued the children. So on that ground, no. But then, again, there was this secret witch trial going on, a sort of invisible witch trial. The woman who brought the suit in a sense because she wanted a witch trial. And her evidence in the trial, again written down laboriously by the magistrate, was basically, I didn't do it. These children were taught witchcraft, but not by me. I heard they were taught by that one's mother. And I'm going, this is crazy. This has absolutely nothing to do with the legal issue of defamation. But that was all and she brought another witness to assert that she'd lived there since 1992 and never been accused of witchcraft, but that someone else in the compound was doing this stuff. And so then the magistrate passes, the judgment of no fault, first on the grounds that the children should have been sued, but then secondly, very interesting, he makes a legal argument. Defamation consists of libel and slander, written and verbal character damaging. So to prove it, you have to prove, first of all, substantial injury by whatever was written or said, and secondly, that it wasn't true. So the injury thing stands, but Mrs. Cassian-Punje did not prove that she's not a witch. And by that, we're going, well, yes, she actually is a witch. And it has, again, this sort of invisible trial within a trial in which this nurse is convicted of witchcraft, both in the court and in the court of public opinion. And then she has to leave town too. She resigned from the hospital and moved to a small clinic in the rural area near where she used to live. Now, what I want to just wrap up there, there's a lot more we could say, but what these cases indicate to me, and I think these cases, it's not just this one little court in Malawi that's doing this. I think up and down Africa, this is happening. And there's literature. John and Jean Komaroff wrote a piece on a court in South Africa where something similar like this is going on. In the interstices of the law, courts are trying to deal with real problems in their communities, which often involve supernatural dimensions. There's a very good paper on courts in Ivory Coast, I think, doing similar kinds of things with witchcraft cases. And what it seems to me to indicate is a way of resolving precisely that problem of justice that I started off with before. Now, I admit, Mrs. Cassian-Punje, the one who brought suit, did not think that justice had been done in that context. She thought that she had been badly mistreated. She, in fact, said to me afterwards that someone in the magistrate's office had asked her for 10,000 kwacha, about $100, in order to get the right verdict. So she wasn't that happy with it. But for the town itself, for the community, for the people, justice had been done. And similarly, I think in the criminal case. And in that context too, a reasonably fair trial, I think, was conducted. And so to me, what's interesting is how in practice, in these very sort of elementary ways, I think this problem of justice is being addressed in these communities. And not through the application of the great rule of human rights, the principle of, no, through case by case, the kind of casuistry of practical jurisprudence in this far-off way. And so for me, when I saw that in the course of these trials, it was encouraging. Because I think that in both of these instances and in many others, some of the fears and concerns and anxieties of the community about these supernatural forces that seem to be causing harm are being addressed, are being comprehensively addressed. They're being listened to by an authority in a properly constituted court of law who is applying principles of verification and validation, proof, that are reasonably sophisticated and imposing punishments that, to me, don't seem way out of whack with the kind of damage that people feel they've suffered. So I'll leave it on that note and take questions if you have any. Okay, great. Briefly on the first, what sorts of reactions and problems have I encountered studying and writing about witchcraft? And I started doing this in the South African context, in the post-apartheid period, which was people fairly sensitive to these sorts of issues. And some people were kind of annoyed that this white man, foreigner, is talking about these things that we don't want to have talked about. And my answer to that was simple. That I lived in Soweto for several years, a long, long time. My friends and family all had major problems connected with these issues. I struggled to find a way to think about them and write about them. So I know they're important, and I'm going to talk about it to the best of my ability. I don't think it satisfied everybody all the time, but it gave me at least the credibility to be allowed to talk about it, and particularly in a way, which was not primarily academic in the sense of my work, much to the annoyance of many people, was never just about kind of filling in debates in the literature. It was really trying to come to terms with something that I had experienced and that my friends were concerned with. And that's why I coined this concept of spiritual insecurity, and an attempt to find a framework for analysing the power relations within which people felt they lived and from which their sense of danger and insecurity was arising. And it was pretty obvious to me that these relations were not solely relations among persons as understood by the annals of social science, that there were all sorts of other entities that people were in power relations with, and that gave them a sense of insecurity, and that created a need to draw on other relations with invisible forces and powers and beings in order to create a sense of security. So that's, I started framing this way of understanding things as a political analysis. My fundamental point came to be that I'm not talking about beliefs, I'm talking about relations, and I'm not talking about relations solely among human persons as understood in the kind of modernist sense, but whatever sets of relations people tell me they're living in and that I can observe them living in. And I call this relational realism, much to the annoyance of my Marxist friends, because they of course think this is all bullshit. Like what's real are the modes of production and the class forces. So I say, somebody's in relation with their ancestors. It's not just that they believe in their ancestors, they're in actual relation. What is ontologically the real thing is the relation. Just the fact that I can't get access to the ancestors and ask them what they think about Joe has nothing to do with the fact that there's a real relation, and that I can study it as a relation, as if I were studying a relation between two persons or two other entities or whatever. So that became the foundation of the intellectual enterprise. And then it raises the question of, well, if what I call spiritual insecurity is in some way related to other forms of insecurity, which I think it is, I think it's related to but not reducible to. So, for instance, where I grew up in Perth, Western Australia, it's one of the most affluent places on the planet. It's got good weather pretty much all year long. People aren't dying or starving. It's one of the least religious places on the planet. There's very little in what I think of as spiritual insecurity. And if the whole world was like Sweden, maybe these sort of issues wouldn't bother people so much. But it's not. The world's not like Perth, and it's not likely to become like Perth. And the thing that also began to realize was that there's a kind of fundamentally, this problem of insecurity that I'm looking at is epistemological too, that it's a question of people knowing that there are forces that they have to manage that shape their lives and destinies, but often not knowing how to manage them. And knowing that if they're not managed correctly, then the consequences can be fatal. And so, in contemporary Africa, not only do you have, as you say, like a proliferation of misfortune, in economic and other, but you also have a proliferation of schemes for interpreting these forces in their broad ways. And so for any one person facing one life event that requires addressing the possibility that they're being confronted or afflicted by invisible forces and whatever, whether it be demons or witches or ancestors or the wrath of God, there are 10 different people who'll come and give the only answer that's capable of saving their lives and bodies and souls. And I think that also creates a special type of insecurity on its own. So my way of dealing with your question is to say, yes, they're related, but spiritual insecurity is not reducible to poverty, violence, disease, other forms of insecurity in life. The phenomenon of child witches, particularly in Kinshasa, which came to attention large part through the work of the Belgian anthropologist Philippe de Buc, and then taken up by Save the Children, who wrote a report based on that. And there's a lot of very unpleasant stuff in life in Kinshasa and Congo. And children are suffering as much, if not more, than anybody. And I wouldn't want to begin to disparage that or diminish the sense of that. But I think the thing about child witches is very complicated. And there's a paper that Philip wrote in the volume edited by Jean Lafontaine called, not the Devil's, I think the Devil's Children it's called. Have you seen that one? It came out last year or the year before, a collection of essays from around the world on I think it's subtitled From Spirit Possession to Witchcraft or something. And in there, he seems to me to be trying to kind of dial back some of the outrage and enthusiasm about the child witches of Kinshasa, because there are a lot of children suffering from a lot of different things in Kinshasa. And one of the points he makes there too, which I made in the lecture, is that it's not always a bad thing to be suspected of having supernatural power. And he shows how some kids actually, especially older kids, can play on that to their own, ends and own interests. The other issue that you were getting at there, remind me what the. Yeah, okay, no, that's the point I was trying to remember. I think you're right. I'm not suggesting that everywhere in Africa, some places in Africa, Congo being, a lot of social order is broken down. And, you can't have a fair witch trial in Soweto either. That was one of the things that really struck me, that it's a terrible place to be accused of being a witch. And the woman who my book is dedicated to was essentially hounded to her death because she was accused of being a witch and had no way of countering that. So I wouldn't want to make that suggestion, but I do want to suggest that things are going on. The point that you made that made me think was that people might be kind of deliberately targeting children, making these accusations in order to get rid of an unwarranted burden. And I'm very skeptical about that. There's a paper, any economists here? If you want to, there's a paper by an economist called Ted Miguel, who's kind of up-and-coming star. I think he's still at Berkeley, development economics. Very smart guy, brilliant guy. He wrote this completely nonsensical paper about witchcraft in Tanzania and witch killings in Tanzania. Basically doing a bunch of surveys and running numbers and regressions and up the wazoo, finding that during periods of unusual rainfall events, more witches were killed. So, like he does the correlation, says, on these years, there was a drought and flood and a drought and a flood, and the number of witches killed increased by this amount. However, when there were epidemics, the witch killings didn't vary significantly. Therefore, there's a positive correlation between weather events and witchcraft killings, which must then mean that families are going, oh, resources are scarce, witches are old women who don't contribute to the, accuse them of witchcraft and get them out of the way, which is, I think, absolute nonsense. Because it may, I believe him that the association with the weather and killing is there, but what he didn't do was run that against mortality. You see, you don't kill witches just because you've got an ingrowing toenail. You kill witches when they've killed someone in your family, or someone you care about, or they're trying to kill you, like that case I suggested. Now, it might be the case, and I suspect it probably is, that adverse weather events are associated with increased mortality, in which case there would be a reason to suspect somebody of having killed somebody, in which case, they might be killed. So it's like the relationship might be there between the weather and the killing, but not through the scarce resources sort of argument. And I'm just very skeptical about those sort of scarce resources arguments anywhere. Because I think the thing is that people really do take this stuff seriously. So, the fact that someone is a witch is much more worrisome than the fact that there's, not enough food on the table. I mean, it in and of itself is sufficient to cause the kind of consequences we see. Okay, I mean, it's a very important question, although I would hesitate to draw the distinction between urban and rural in the way you're doing. I don't think it really applies so well. But certainly Christianity is particularly important in these issues, and forms of Christianity in particular. Forms that I like to call enthusiastic religion. And I wrote a paper about religious enthusiasm before I knew what religious enthusiasm was, because I thought it just meant people are, praise the Lord kind of enthusiastic, when actually it's a term that has a long history in the study of religion. There's a wonderful book written in the 1950s by Reginald Knox called Religious Enthusiasm, and it's a term that was used by David Hume, the 18th century Scottish philosopher, who on the one hand has papish superstition, the priest-ridden, ignorant peasants of Europe, who are, burdened by this superstitious nonsense of the Catholic Church. On the other hand, you had the religious enthusiasm, equally irrational, of the John Wesleys and the kind of churches inspired in there. And the key to it is the idea of literally the word comes from the Greek entheos, God within, and it's the idea of a direct connection with divine power, with God. And that is the idea that is incredibly useful in African life and has been incredibly powerful over several decades. But everywhere you go now, there are people claiming to be able to connect directly with the power of the Holy Spirit and Jesus into our immediate circumstances to deal with problems of wealth and health and family relations and everything. And that form of Christianity, which, again, it's enthusiastic in every sense of the word, is incredibly important. And what it has brought, and many people have written about this, it brings a very strong consciousness of evil power into everyday life. So along with the Holy Spirit and Jesus comes the devil, Satan, and the legions of evil forces organized under this hierarchical power, which in most places in Africa is a comparatively new conception of the spirit world, if you like. And what happens is that, and this could take us into a long discussion of the notion of belief and why I don't like talking about beliefs in the sense of propositions or systems of belief and whatever. Because people who worry about witches, it's not that they subscribe to a system of belief in which witches are this, that, and the other thing, and they can do this, that, and it's no, they worry about these invisible forces that persons might have access to and that can cause harm, and we don't know what they are and how they work. And sometimes there's more or less settled understandings of them, but other times it's all up in the air. So along comes the preacher and says, you know what witchcraft is? It's Satan. And it's Satan and the demons that are being in league with these evil people who are polluting the neighborhood with their evil. And you go, wow, that makes a whole lot of sense to me. And it's not that, I subscribe, I lost my traditional African system of belief as part of the Zulu nation and moved over to Pentecostal Christianity. It's just that these are different ways of figuring an understanding of power relations that people take very seriously and worry about. And one of the reasons why these churches have been so phenomenally successful in Africa is that they offer people a plan, a process, a practice for dealing with these dangerous forces. The discussion around the oath was very interesting because, and then what the children were also saying was because one of the things that they did when they came out saying we've been taught witchcraft is they all go off to church. So the little girl who can't testify under oath because she doesn't really answer the questions about God and so on, Jesus correctly, tells about how we've been going to church to deal with the witchcraft. And it becomes part of that narrative. And what's interesting too, I should have really elaborated on this in more detail if I'd had time, is the notion of confession. Because of course confession is a central act in the Christian practice. It's also central to legal process and has a very deep significance in historically and traditionally and present day in relation to witchcraft issues in Africa. And the magistrate says confession is the central thing, and in that he replicates, the inquisitors of the 16th century. That you don't put a witch to death until she's confessed. You might have to torture her half to death in order to get the confession, but then you can put her to death because justice is done. And that's the same kind of line. But there's also, and this comes up particularly in the Christian churches, a genre of confession which is about, it's the sort of predicate to deliverance and to redemption and to cleansing and so on. So people will confess the most amazing and outlandish things of eating their children and gigantic orgies in all kinds. And there's even a genre of published literature of these kinds of confessions, which epistemologically they're very interesting documents because they are supposed to be literally true, but they're not literally true. So, there's my kid, like I've eaten 8 of my children, but there they are. What does that actually mean? It'd be very interesting to see that playing out in a court where, if a witch does confess in that kind of manner, then I think the magistrate would lock them up. But the curious thing is that if you confess and then are cleansed of witchcraft, you could also be culpable under the law because you have pretended to the powers of witchcraft. So I think that the epistemological status of confession is very, very important and deeply connected with the relations with God and so on. There was a question over there. I'd like to answer that yes. I wouldn't say, very substantial. I'm not somebody who wants to change the world in any kind of way. But if you read my little book, Madumo, it's really the story of a friend of mine in Soweto who was accused of killing his mother by witchcraft. His mother died and he was accused of killing her by his brother, who attended one of these Christian churches, the ZCC, and he was told by a prophet that it was an inside job, and then he was chased away from home and was living on the street, was pretty miserable. And so then I showed up. It was during my summer vacation. I was staying in Soweto every year, and I went back and found him down and out, and over the course of a couple of years helped pay for his treatment with a traditional healer, and eventually he became unbewitched. Some of you have to read the book for your class, so I won't tell you the whole story. Spoiler alert! But I sometimes teach the book, and at the end of the session, that somebody always says, "So how's Madumo? How's Madumo now?" And sometimes I go, "Well, why don't you ask him that?" So I called him up on Skype, and I said, "Oh, there he is." Well, I think, my position on that is that I think these things are so complicated that it is foolhardy for someone, even someone as brilliant as me, who's devoted so many decades of my life to studying and trying to understand these things. It would be very foolish for me to march into Malawi or Soweto or anywhere else and start telling people what they should be doing. So the whole point of this talk was to show that people are addressing these issues themselves, figuring out ways of dealing with the issues of justice and security that arise around them. And that the people, the international human rights people who are happily running in to try and tell, Africans to respect the human rights of vulnerable groups, I'm saying, back off a little bit. Listen to what people are doing. Observe what people are actually doing, because it's much more complicated than you realize, and that often our efforts to make things better just make them worse. So that's my take on that. Well, you come to the nub of the issue, and a good part of me wants to agree with you and say, no, you're right, these are imaginary offences on the one hand and a real offence on the other hand, and the rights of the person offended against, trump everything else. That is, that's the way of the colonial authorities. It's the way of the international human rights view on things, and perhaps it's the right way. But whereas we might want to say confidently that the offences against the 10 who feel themselves victims are imaginary, their sense of injustice is very real. And I think that the sense of injustice or the quest for justice that is thwarted or unfulfilled is very dangerous and very problematic in any kind of community. And so if you have a situation where people feel an injustice has been done to them, but they have no recourse at all, then I think the damage that creates in the community and social life outweighs, if you like, the measure of injustice that was doled out to the two people in these two cases. Now, if Mrs. Kasimpanje had been killed by a mob, and there were moments where she could very well have been killed by mobs in the town, that I think is over the edge. Where she fails in a defamation suit and is where that opinion of her is reinforced through that court thing, yes, it's an injustice, but it's not a huge one on the scale of things. And I don't think, that's why I say it's a casuistic reasoning. It's bit by bit. It's saying, well, in this case, the injustice done to her by confirming the view of the majority that she's a witch is outweighed by what is contributed to the authority of the court by proceeding in this kind of way. So I think if I had been the magistrate and had thrown the case the way I would, it would just have led to an undermining of the authority of the court, which was the colonial experience, that people say these courts are not concerned with the things that really matter to us. People are being killed, and they say it's all imaginary, and therefore, there's no justice. And I think the legacy of that can be seen in every community in Africa. There are some, and I think you find them more in South Africa than anywhere else, and I think they tend to be whiter than most African jurists. I think if you're living in a context like this guy, so for him it's a very real thing. And we've got to remember too that this is not just some kind of absurd, Africanism thing, this fear. It's also very much part of many religious mindsets. And so I think given that he is in that world, given that he's trying to constitute the authority of the court through dealing with cases and cases and cases, I think he's doing a good job. And I think that by allowing, what's seen as a fair trial for people accused, in one case, by exonerating two of the accused, and then gently suggesting a remedy in relation to the third, who everybody thinks, I think he's doing. It's not absolute justice, but I think he is, he is doing justice in a really practical way. Whereas I think there's very real problems with outsiders particularly, but coming in and saying, these are imaginary crimes, witchcraft doesn't exist, this is, like in the colonial era, it was the reasonable chap on the Clapham Common bus, according to that standard of the reasonable man, this sort of behaviour is unreasonable. And the international human rights people have an element of that too. And I think that's doing an injustice of another kind. It's imposing one ontology on another people's world, which is a form of injustice in and of itself. So as I say, I don't want to make too much of these two little cases, but to me they do show signs of an emerging jurisprudence that is I think really getting at something important.
We have to stop there, but there still are things we can drink, and we have time to chat. So please come around. And thank you so much.
You're welcome.